Oh, look at that. Look at that. Good morning. I know some of you are feeling really good this morning after watching some TV last night, so I'm happy for you. Yeah. I got to go to South Carolina yesterday. I was at a youth rally on Friday and Saturday driving back through. So being in South Carolina, there were a whole lot more people who were watching a different football game than y'all. And I definitely enjoyed being in their presence. I told them about how fond you guys are of not saying amen during a sermon, but you'll say roll tide during a sermon. They enjoyed that. And I thought that was pretty good. But I'm glad I'm home. It's good to be back. And I'm glad to be able to start a class here to teach the auditorium for the next about 3 months or so. The elders have, kind of picked an idea that I think makes a whole lot of sense in that we have tried to combine a lot of the material that we teach in our Sunday morning Bible classes. And here's what I mean by that. We've used, because the Lads to Leaders program is so prevalent and we're able to do so much good stuff with that, and because Lads to Leaders is supposed to involve the whole congregation, Lads to Leaders is not just here's something for the youth group to do. This is like for the congregation. We've tried to use the teaching material that Lads to Leaders recommends and not just teach it to our kids, but to teach it to everybody in the congregation so that we can all have a similar knowledge and a similar understanding of the subject. So that we can talk about it not just when we're at church or not just when you're in a secluded classroom somewhere. You can talk about it at home. You can talk about it with other people because they've had that material as well. And so, in that regard, we have 6 months out of the year where basically everybody in the congregation on Sunday morning has a similar theme for what they're talking about in the morning. Now, it's put on different levels for the different classes, and I think that's neat. And then the other thing that we've tried to do for the past 2 or 3 years is to have one class that we try to pick a topic that is, of great importance, or that is of immediate need, or that is just a very foundational class topic. And we try to bring that to the high school, the young professionals class, the young adult class, and the auditorium class. And we do those throughout the year. And so I've really enjoyed being able to teach whichever class that is throughout the year. Started in the teenage class, and then moved to the young adult class, and then moved to the back classroom, and then to bring that same class here for this next 3 months or so, for us to all be able to talk about the same kind of material. I think it helps us as a congregation come closer together. We're studying the same kinds of things. We are affirming the same kinds of things together. It doesn't matter if you're in the youth group. It doesn't matter if you're in the auditorium class. These are things that we have all studied and talked about and found beneficial. And I think that helps us as a family, as a church group, to be united. Certainly, the Bible talks an awful lot about being of one mind, of sharing the same thought, of sharing the same heart. And these classes give us the chance to do that. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start in Matthew chapter 22. So if you would, open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 22, and we'll introduce the idea. Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse number 34. In Matthew 22:34, it says, "When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. 'Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is great and first commandment.'" end. The second is to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Last year, we had the class that rotated to all four groups. And last year, that class was based on our faith. It was based on our relationship with God. We talked about the church. We talked about the nature of the church and why the identity of the church was so important. We talked about how difficult it can be in today's culture to find the church that the Bible describes because we live in such a multiplicitous culture. We live in a culture now where the prevailing thought process is everybody can do whatever they want to do just as long as you don't step on my toes when you do it. That's the world that we live in right now. You do whatever you want to do, just don't step on my toes while you do it. And so finding the identity of the church that Jesus died for and finding the identity of the church that we see demonstrated and patterned in the New Testament can be difficult to find. How a person enters that church, how a person enters into a relationship with God. We talked for 3 months last year about how we as individuals relationship with God, and then how we as a group of people should identify as the church that God has given to us, that Jesus died for. And so we call that religion, right? That's what the word religion, when we think about the word religion, that's what we think about. We think about things that are spiritual in nature. We think about our relationship with God. We think about what we do in church, how church is organized. We think about all these different kinds of facts and things. And that's about religion. And when the lawyer comes to Jesus in Matthew chapter 22 and says, "What is the greatest commandment?" Jesus answers him with a religious answer. The greatest commandment, the most important thing that you as a human being need to do is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. That is that relationship with God, right? And Jesus wasn't the first one to acknowledge that or kind of figure that out. We have prophets in the Old Testament talking about what is the whole duty of man, what is the whole responsibility of man. It is to love God, is to fear God, is to walk humbly before your God. It is. We have all of these passages going back into the Old Testament and through the New Testament that tell us that we're to love God, that we're supposed to have the right relationship with God. And so we talk of first importance about that relationship. Here's what I find interesting. The lawyer is trying to trick Jesus and find some way to defeat him in an argument. And this was a common pastime in ancient times. Actually, for many of us, it's still a common pastime today to try to win an argument. But back then, because they didn't have as many forms of entertainment as we do, that was really one of the main forms of public address. One of the main forms of public discourse in the ancient world was to meet in the marketplace or to meet in the gates of the city, at the front of the city when everybody's coming and going, and debate, argue. The Greek philosophers were engaged in this kind of stuff. Paul has to do this at Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17. Jesus has to do this repeatedly. Matthew chapter 22 is a really good example of this type of communication between people. Because everything in Matthew 22 is Matthew pointing out the different groups of Jewish leaders who tried to trick Jesus. That's what Matthew 22 is all about. The Herodians tried to get Jesus. The Sadducees tried to get Jesus. The Pharisees tried to get Jesus. All of these different people came to Jesus and put a test before him, and he shut each one of them down, didn't he? That was what was so amazing, so impressive about Jesus. And then after he finished answering all their questions, and once he finished passing all of their tests, we go to Matthew chapter 23, where he lights into them. He gives them what for because they haven't passed the tests. And we're going to mention that in just a moment. Go ahead, Rogers. Matthew 22:39. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? Right? Didn't that used to be the normal? If you lived in if you had neighbors, you knew your neighbors. I heard it described, there once was a time when we were front porch people, right? Who had a rocking chair on the front porch and sat outside, and that way anybody came walking by, anybody came through the neighborhood, you knew them, you saw them because you spent time out there. And now we're back porch people. That does not surprise me. That's a fair question. That's a very good question. Put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it. All right, we're going to come back to this idea of who is my neighbor, right? But the first question the question that these Sadducees come to Jesus with is, and Jesus knows that they're testing him. Jesus knows that they're trying to trip him up, okay? And he says, what's the greatest commandment? What's the most important thing that I need to be focusing on if I'm going to be, and this was a very technical question. Now here's what's interesting. In debate, the best technique for winning a debate is to offer your opponent as little ammunition as possible that they can use against you. Here's what I mean by that. Have you ever heard the phrase, if you give a man enough rope, he'll what? He'll hang himself, right? That is a very common debate tactic, is to ask someone a question and just let them talk. Oh yeah, you just keep talking. Because the longer you talk, the more stuff I find out that I can use against you, right? And so a very clear and concise answer is a weapon in and of itself in winning a debate. And so and one of the main purposes of that is, or one of the main tactics in that is you only answer the question you've been given. When I was a senior at Freed-Hardeman University, all the senior Bible majors had to take, they called it seminar class, but it was basically a class on argumentation. We had 2 philosophy professors and also taught Bible classes at Freed-Hardeman, and they would spend half of that semester talking about the importance of being able to defend your faith, right? The importance of being able to have an answer for the hope that lies within you, being ready in season and out of season, right? The way that the Bible talks about our preparedness to know the Scriptures and know how to present those arguments to people. And then after they taught you those things, you had to demonstrate them. The way you did that was you debated the professor in front of the class. Now, here I was, 18 years old, 19 years old, standing next to, a 47-year-old PhD holding professor who's done this class for 30 years, right? Something like that. And I'm supposed to argue and debate and go, and go toe to toe. And so we each kind of get to pick a topic that we want to debate. And I remember thinking, I better pick something pretty easy because I don't want this to get too ugly. And so I picked the existence of God. Does God exist? I figured if I can defend anything, if I can argue anything, I can argue that God is real. I can argue, that God exists. And my professor said, that's wonderful. And I got nervous. He was happy to debate that. So I thought, no, maybe I've got myself in over my head. But then I did something even worse. There came a point in the class, in the course of the semester, where we had to submit the debate proposal, all right? The statement that was going to be the focus of the debate. And as I mentioned in these tactics, instead of keeping it short and sweet, God is real, affirm or deny, I came up with this lengthy affirming that the God of the Bible is real and all these other words. And when my professor saw that, he just smiled. And he said, "You've gotten very specific here, haven't you?" Because every word that I put in that proposition, I didn't know this at the time. When we stood up to have a little demonstration in front of the class, he took every single word that I had put in that statement and picked each one of them out and used them as an arrow and shot me with each and every one of them. This word is wrong, this word is wrong, this word is wrong, this word. Here's why. If this word weren't in the statement, maybe we could have a good discussion on it. But because he put this word in the statement, the whole thing is false. And then he did, the very next word. Well, you can't even use that word. You can't. And so the more ammunition you give somebody, the more likely they are to use it against you. Why do I say that? Because the lawyer comes to Jesus and says, "What's the greatest commandment? What's the most important thing I need to be focused on?" Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength," which is a quote from Deuteronomy chapter 6. The Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." And that's the right answer. Everybody was happy with that. And Jesus could have been done. But he kept talking. Now, Jesus is a master debater. And we see examples of this. Jesus never lost a debate in the Gospels. So Jesus knows how to deal with people, how to talk to people. But he says, "Oh, and by the way, let me offer you some more information." And the lawyer was like, "Oh, good." Because he got that part right. But maybe the next part will be wrong. What's the next part? What does it offer up as the next statement? The second greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And then he offers up another statement. And what's that? You can hang the entire Old Testament on those two things. Now, if you're a debater and you're looking for some way to argue with somebody, and they say that they can sum up the entire Old Testament in two things, well, like my professor over there, you just start to grin a little bit. Oh, what were you thinking? Jesus offers this extra information. Last year, when we had the class that went to all four groups, it was about loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It was about the church. It was about spiritual truth. It was about seeking the best understanding for that in our own lives and in the life of the church. But Jesus said that's not enough. Jesus said that's not enough. That's the first commandment. But that in and of itself is not the summary of the Old Testament. Because we have to take what we have dedicated spiritually and religiously and with our faith, loving the Lord our God, and then what do we have to do? We have to add to it what? How we treat other people. How we treat other people becomes the complete picture in Jesus' summary of the Old Testament. And I keep calling it the Old Testament. Did Jesus call it the Old Testament? Did the Pharisees call it the Old Testament? No, they said this is the Bible. This summarizes the Bible. This summarizes God's word to us in two things: love God and love your neighbor. In philosophy, we call the second greatest commandment ethics. That's the word. We think about ethics maybe as a topic that we don't engage in very much. Unless you are in college and you decide to get a philosophy degree or something like that, then you can debate ethics and morals and all that stuff. But we don't use that kind of language on a normal basis. And so we think that ethics is some kind of thing that just, professors and people, who write books and have debates and all that kind of stuff are engaged in. But ethics is putting into practice the way that you treat other people. Jesus says that loving the Lord your God is of first importance. However, if you neglect the second greatest commandment, then you are not complete. There is more to it than that. And Jesus uses this base to move into Matthew chapter 23. Very quickly, just kind of note this with me. In Matthew 23, there are the woes against the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus basically says, I've listened to you come at me with all your questions and all your tests, and I've listened to all your debates and all your arguments, and we're finished with that. Now let me tell you what I see when I look at you. And he turns to the crowds and he says, well, the scribes and Pharisees, they sure do know their Bible. Well, they sure do know their stuff. So you need to listen to what they say, but don't what? Don't do what they do. Don't do what they do. Well, they got great knowledge. When it comes to how they act, ethics, don't follow them. And notice as we go through the ways that Jesus says in Matthew 23 that the Pharisees and the scribes break the first commandment and break the second commandment. Notice what he says. We've got these kinds of problems. Of course, you know, the definition of hypocrisy in verse 3, practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do, for they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens on other people that are hard to bear, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. This is the definition. These are the points of hypocrisy. Someone who doesn't act the way they tell others to act, someone who expects other people to act better than they themselves are expected to act, and then someone who only acts in a certain way to get recognition from other people. You notice those 3 points? That's the definition of hypocrisy. So anytime we act in any of those 3 ways, we are guilty of hypocrisy. And so Jesus is not pleased with them, and he points these things out, and he says these are problems. And then in verse 13, he begins to say, woe to you. It's the exact opposite of the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they that mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. The opposite of a blessing is a woe. Oh, woe is me. Why are they in trouble? They're in trouble because of these actions. Verse 13, you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Now, when we look at each one of these woes over the next few minutes, I want you to tell me, is Jesus accusing them of breaking the first commandment, the second commandment, both, or neither? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we'll see that they don't all fit into this pattern that we're talking about. But Jesus says 2 things in verse 13. You shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You shut the door in their face. They're ready to go into the kingdom and you shut it in their face. You don't enter yourselves and you don't allow others to go in who want to. Now, which one of the 2 first, second commandments would you say Jesus says they're breaking here? Both? You see both? I see both there. The first statement, you don't enter the kingdom of heaven yourself. You don't do the things required. You don't have the relationship with God to enter the kingdom of heaven yourself. And on top of that, when other people try to get in, what do? You block the door. You prevent them from being able to go where they want to go. Verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and then when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. What do you think there? This has always been kind of a tricky one for me. They're doing evangelism. They're going around trying to convert people. But then once they're converted, it says they become twice the child of hell as you are. Which that's pretty insulting, don't you think? Not only are you a child of hell, but everybody that follows you, they're twice as bad. What, Rogers? He didn't have as much knowledge or information, and so when he's converted and goes out, he acts twice as bad. That's a possibility. That's true. That's good. Right? Have you ever had to use one of those risograph machines? Anybody ever seen those risograph machines, the copiers? And it's one of those old, they're a little bit better nowadays. We have these laser copiers and things. But if I take this sheet of paper right here and I go put it on the copy machine and I hit copy, it's going to spit out an image of this. Well, what if I set this original over here to the side and I take the copy and I put it on and I hit copy and I copy it and then I remove it and then I make a copy of the copy and then I make another copy of the copy and then I make another copy of the copy and then I make another copy of the copy. By the time I get to the 10th generation of copies and I hold that 10th copy up to the original, what happens? You can still tell that there's basically the same stuff there, but it's not nearly as clear an image anymore. It's become faded. It's become warped. There are going to be problems that have come up because it gets worse. It gets exaggerated the farther on you go. And maybe like what Jane is talking about, when somebody makes a copy of themselves, makes a proselyte, I want you to follow after me. I want you to be my disciple, so you do what I do. But then they have other problems in their own. They become more zealous, and they not only pick up the false teachings that you taught them, then they have their own false teachings as well and carry those. And then when they go out and make a proselyte, they've got the problems of the original teacher, they've got the problems of the new convert, and then the third person has their own set of problems as well. So now we've doubled it. We've compounded all of these issues and all these problems. So maybe that's what it is. Rogers? How? With an unarmed man. Yeah. That's right. There are people, Proverbs says about that, don't answer a fool according to his folly or you just fall into his own trap, right? That's what the Proverbs says. So do you think this is breaking the commandment about loving God or loving neighbor? What would you say? Or both? I see both. Again, we're giving people wrong information about their relationship with God and we're taking them down the wrong path. Verse 16, woe to you blind guides, who say if anyone swears by the temple, it's nothing. But if someone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath. What is greater, the gold, the temple that has made the gold sacred? What do you think? The temple, exactly. The temple is way more important. When you get caught up in the value of the stuff in the temple, you become materialistic. God doesn't care about the gold. God could care less about the gold. It's the sacred nature of the temple that makes it important. And so because we're talking about that theme and that idea, which of those two commandments would you say are being violated? Loving God. I mean, that's the way I see it. The temple is the house of God. That's exactly right. And because you care more about the physical possessions, because you care more about the gold or the ornamentation, you have neglected what matters. We can go down to verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. What do you think about this one? Tithing is about what? Which one of the two commandments would tithing fit into? Your relationship with God, right? Right. So he starts off with an idea about tithing. He says, you tithe your mint, your dill, your cumin. These are the little spices, right, that you grow in your garden. You got to your garden and you got your spice garden and you pick 10% of the leaves off of that spice garden and you make sure that you bring those leaves to the temple, and then what do you neglect? Justice, mercy, and faith. Now, when I hear words like justice and mercy, which of those two commandments come to mind? God is just and God is merciful to whom? To mankind. When I show justice and when I show mercy, who am I showing them to? Other people, my neighbors, right? Right. Being able to forgive, being faithful and honest, being just in your treatment, being merciful to other people. I think that that's talking about loving your neighbor as yourself. And that begins to get us into, well, let's look at we got a couple more that I want to look at, 25, 27, and 29, just to finish out this discussion. 25, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and plate, but inside you're full of greed, self-indulgence, and you need to clean the inside of the cup and plate that the outside can also be clean. Now here we're talking about our character. They're acting one way on the outside, but inside they're not pure. Which one of those commandments could you put under that category? Can you act? This is another example of what it means to be a hypocrite, I think. On the outside, you're whitewashed, you look good, you're clean, but inside you're still impure, you're defiled. Can you act that way towards God? Can you try to put on a good face towards God? We might can try, but is God gonna be fooled by it? Absolutely not. You can't fool God. We certainly try sometimes. We read Genesis chapter 3, and we think, boy, Adam and Eve were so dumb. Adam and Eve were so dumb. What did they think? They could hide behind a tree and God wouldn't find them? But don't we all hide behind trees at different times in our life? Don't we all have something or some time or some event, and we're like, I'm just going to push this over here in the closet. I'm just going to push this over in the corner, under the rug. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. So we can try to put on a good face before God, but if the inside isn't right, God's going to see right through it. Can we try to put on a false face in front of other people? We definitely can. We can get away with it too. Deeds done in secret versus deeds done in the light, right? That kind of discussion. And so we're being duplicitous. That's a big word for it, but we're liars, We're hypocrites. That's what he says in verse 28, full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And then verse 29, verse 27, same kind of thing, whitewashed tombs. Outwardly you appear beautiful, but inside you're full of dead bones and uncleanness. Verse 29, you build the tombs of the prophets, you decorate the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in those days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding the blood of the prophets. But you witness against yourself. You are sons of those murderers. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. And he has some other wonderful things to say about them. But what about verse 29? As you go out and you decorate the tombs of the prophets, and you say, we wouldn't have acted that way. We wouldn't have done what they did back in the old days. It's not, you're exactly right. They are hot on the heels of following in those footsteps because they're going to do the same thing to Jesus. They're going to do the exact same thing to Jesus, which is what? They're going to do what? They're going to commit what? Murder. Murder. Would you put that in the first commandment or the second commandment? I mean, murder is a violation of God's, right? They thought they were killing a person when in reality they were putting the Son of God on a cross. I've always wondered why Jesus used this debate tactic when the lawyer comes to Jesus and says, I want to know the answer to one question. Why did Jesus give him 3 answers? Why did Jesus say 3 things? All Jesus had to do was say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's it. And the answer was done. And the lawyer, that would have been the end of it. It was still the end of it, but there wouldn't have been any other ammunition. But instead, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Everything that we read in the Old Testament is summarized in those two ideas. And here's why I think he did that. Were the Pharisees and the scribes known for being especially kind and good to other people? No, they were not. If you were going to compliment a scribe or a Pharisee on anything about themselves, their character, or how they, what they did, what was something that they were good at? They had a big show, right? Was it easy to become a Pharisee? You ever think about this? When Paul is bragging over in Corinthians, and he's like, look, if we want to compare resumes, my resume is pretty good. I'm not only a Jew, but I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. And not only am I of the tribe of Benjamin, but I am a Pharisee of Pharisees. What does that mean? Why does he use that to brag about his stature and his status? Do you know that a Pharisee had to memorize the first 5 books of the Old Testament before they could become a Pharisee? The Torah, the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Had to know them. Had to be able to stand up and quote them before you could be a Pharisee. You entered into the inner circle at that point. There were other requirements that you had, but that's just one of the strict requirements in order to become a Pharisee. And so these people prided themselves on looking religious. Would you agree with that statement? Does that statement make sense? The Pharisees prided themselves on looking religious. It is so important that we have a right relationship with God. And so we're going to know the commandments, and we're going to tithe the leaves on our spice trees, and we're going to pray really loudly on the street corners. And when we give to the poor, we're going to make sure everybody knows about it. We're going to do all of these things because we want to be right with God. And so when the Pharisee says, what's the first great commandment? And Jesus says, well, it's to love the Lord your God. And the Pharisee's like, good deal, because I got that. So what did Jesus do? He said, however. Jesus is good at that, isn't he? Jesus is good at that. A rich young ruler came to Jesus, didn't he? And he said, Lord, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, well, we got some commandments, follow them. We got some commandments, follow them. And what does the rich young ruler say? I do that. Good deal. Oh, it was nice talking to you. Check in with you next time. And Jesus said, but, one thing you lack, right? Go sell everything you have. Give that money to the poor, and then come and you can be my disciple. Can I ignore that last part? But Jesus said, hey, that's great. I'm glad that you do that. Here's what you're not doing. Isn't that what our character is like? Isn't that what we like to do? I can tell you all day long the good stuff that I do. I mean, the list may not be that long, but I'll still tell you about it. I can tell you the good stuff I do all day long. I don't necessarily like to sit back and say, here's the problem. Here's the bad stuff. And so when the lawyer comes to Jesus and says, what's the first great commandment? The lawyer knows the answer. Because when we talk about this neighbor situation next week, in the other gospel, when Jesus answers, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, what does the lawyer say next? Who is my neighbor? He says, you have answered well. Isn't that, don't you think Jesus felt good about that? That the lawyer said, oh, good job, Jesus. He didn't need the lawyer's affirmation. But the lawyer says, yes, that's correct. You got that answer right. So the lawyer already knew the answer to this question. He's just seeing what Jesus says. So when the lawyer asks, what's the first commandment? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God, the lawyer can say, absolutely. And I already do that, so we don't have a problem, do we? But Jesus says, but wait, one thing you lack. He didn't say one thing. He said, that's great, but you have missed out on the second half of the equation. You have missed out on the second half of the equation, and it involves how you treat other people. And so in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus lays it on the line. He says, you do this against other people, you do this against other people, and it gets all the way to the point where the last thing he says there in verses 29 and following is, how do you treat other people? By doing what? Committing what? Murder. You're out here picking 10% of the leaves off of your spice garden, but you're guilty of murder. You have missed the point. So last year, we spent a good deal of time talking about how do I have that right relationship with God? How do I love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength? But then we follow it up now for the next few weeks. Now, how do I love my neighbor as myself? Because this is the complete equation if we want to be who God wants us to be. I'm looking forward to it. Hope to be back next week. Thanks.